You ever hear a baby cry in the middle of a Sicilian thunderstorm? That was me, and some say the sky's been talking about me ever since. You know, people like to think a man's story starts when he makes his first move in the world, when he takes a corner, makes a score, or puts somebody in the ground. But mine? It started long before I ever touched the streets. It was November 24, 1897, in a place called Lercurafritti, a little Sicilian town carved into the dusty hills. That night the wind howled like a pack of hungry wolves, and the sky cracked open with lightning that turned the fields white for just a blink. My mother told me later the rain came down in sheets so hard you couldn't hear your own thoughts. But in the middle of all that noise, a new sound cut through my first cry. They named me Salvatore Lucania. A name with old country weight, a name you couldn't whisper without someone knowing exactly what family you came from. We were poor, not the kind of poor where you cut back on meat, but the kind where meat was something you saw maybe twice a year. My father, Antonio, worked in the sulfur mines, his hands cracked and blackened from the rock dust. My mother, Rosalia, kept us alive with bread she made herself and whatever greens she could pull from the earth. Even back then, the air smelled of two things: hope, and something darker. Sicily was like that. You grew up under the sun, but you always knew there were shadows close by. When I was just a boy, I used to sit by the window, listening to the old men talk in the street below. They'd whisper names I didn't understand, names that made their voices drop and their eyes dart toward the corners. I didn't know it then, but those names belonged to men who carried the kind of power the church wouldn't bless but the people respected. That was my first lesson about this world: sometimes the real authority ain't written in any law. By 1906, we'd had enough of the hunger, the hard labor, and the ceiling that life in Sicily put over your head. My father heard there was work in America, not good work, but work that paid in real money. Enough to send a boy to school, maybe even buy him a suit one day. So one morning, the whole family packed what little we had. I remember my mother folding her wedding scarf into the trunk like it was treasure. I didn't know it then, but we were leaving behind more than a house. We were leaving behind a life we'd never get back. The journey was a blur of salt water and sickness. Steerage class, down in the belly of the ship where the air was thick with sweat and coal dust. You couldn't tell where one family ended and the next began. Kids cried themselves to sleep every night, and grown men coughed like their lungs were already giving up. But every morning we'd hear talk of what was waiting on the other side, a city where the streets were crowded with people, sure, but also crowded with chances. One night I crept up on deck. The sea was black as ink, and the moonlight turned the waves into silver knives. I leaned over the rail, feeling the cold wind on my face, and I thought if the ocean couldn't swallow me now, maybe nothing could. I didn't know it yet, but that feeling, the one that told me I'd survive whatever came next, it would follow me my whole life. After nearly 2 weeks, the ship slowed. You could hear it in the way the engines eased, like a giant catching its breath. People pressed against the rails, necks craning, searching for the skyline they'd been dreaming about. And then, through a haze of morning mist, she appeared, the Statue of Liberty. Everyone around me gasped like they'd seen a saint herself step out of heaven. My mother crossed herself. My father just stared, his jaw set like he wasn't sure if this was salvation or the start of another hustle. Me? I looked up at that green lady holding her torch and thought, all right, show me what you got. We landed at Ellis Island, a place that smelled like disinfectant and damp wool. Immigration officers barked questions in a language I didn't understand, and men in uniforms looked at us like they were deciding what kind of trouble we'd grow into. My name got twisted in their mouths. Salvatore Lucania became Charlie somewhere between their clipboard and their pen. I didn't correct M. I was 8 years old, and already I knew, sometimes the smart play is to let people think they're the ones in charge. From there, they herded us into the belly of Manhattan, the Lower East Side. Tenements stacked on tenements. Streets so crowded you couldn't see the cobblestones for all the feet. It smelled like bread, horse manure, and the river depending on which way the wind blew. That first night in America, I lay on a mattress that sagged like a fishing net, staring at the cracked ceiling. Somewhere outside a fight broke out, shouts, a scream, the quick sound of boots running on wet pavement. My mother whispered a prayer. My father muttered something about keeping our heads down. But I couldn't sleep. Not because I was scared, no, I was curious. Because out there, past the flickering lamplight, I could feel it. This city had teeth. And one way or another, I was gonna learn how to bite back. And that was the real beginning. Not the thunderstorm. Not the crossing. Not even the moment my name changed. The real beginning was that night on the Lower East Side, when a boy who'd just stepped off the boat decided he wasn't here to be eaten alive. They say the Lower East Side was where angels came to lose their wings. Me, I never had any to begin with. The Lower East Side, 1907. You could smell it before you saw it: hot bread from a pushcart on Hester Street, horse droppings steaming in the gutters, pickled herring, coal smoke, all of it mixing into one big perfume that stuck to your clothes. And the noise, God, the noise. Street hawkers yelling in Yiddish, Irish mothers calling their kids in for supper, piano music spilling from a saloon doorway. It was chaos, sure. But it was the kind of chaos you could learn from if you paid attention. Our tenement was a 6-story brick coffin with windows that rattled every time a trolley car clanged past. One toilet for the whole floor. Rats in the hallway big enough to vote. But to me, it was a step up from Sicily. Back there you could starve quietly. Here you could starve loud, and maybe, if you had the guts, you could change your odds. I was 9 when I started making my first moves. Not big ones, just running errands for the older boys, keeping watch while they snatched wallets off drunks or shook down a fruit stand for protection money. A nickel here, a dime there. Enough to buy candy for my kid sisters or maybe a shoe shine to keep my Sunday best looking sharp. Thing is, I learned quick, it wasn't the toughest guy who lasted out here. It was the one who knew when to keep his mouth shut, when to smile, and when to disappear. That's how you survive in a place where every street corner's got its own king. One of those kings was a red-headed Irish kid named Jimmy Red Hanley. He was maybe 16, ran a crew of boys who owned the block near Orchard Street. Red had a way of making people laugh right before he picked their pocket. I liked him. He taught me how to play craps in the alley behind Katz's Deli, how to palm a coin without anyone seeing, and more important, how to keep my eyes moving without looking like I was watching. But the Lower East Side wasn't just Irish turf. 2 streets over you had Jewish gangs, smart, fast, and organized. That's where I met Meyer Lansky. He was a couple years older than me, short, quiet, but with eyes like steel traps. We started talking over a dice game one afternoon, and before I knew it, we were running little jobs together, hustling tourists, moving bootleg cigars, things that didn't seem like much at the time. The thing about Meyer was he didn't waste words. He studied people. He could tell you who in a crowd was carrying cash, who was carrying a knife, and who was carrying both. We were just kids, but even then I could feel it, there was something in him that was gonna go far. And he must have seen something in me too, because he kept me close. Life down there was a constant lesson in balance. On one side you had priests telling you to keep clean, work hard, and wait for heaven. On the other, you had the streets showing you that heaven was for suckers and hell, well, hell could be profitable if you played it right. One winter night I got my first taste of how quick things could turn. Me and Red were standing outside a bar on Delancey, working the crowd for loose change, when this big Italian guy, must have been 30, came out drunk, waving his arms and yelling about losing his hat. Red grins, slips a hand toward the guy's coat pocket. But the man was quicker than he looked. He caught Red's wrist, twisted it hard, and pulled a knife faster than I'd ever seen. Time slowed. I saw Red's face go pale, the street lamp catching the blade. Without thinking, I stepped forward and shoved the man in the chest. Not hard enough to hurt him, just enough to break his focus. Red yanked free and we both bolted down the street, the man's curses chasing us until the sound got swallowed by the crowd. Later that night, Red gave me half his take. For saving my hide, he said. But it wasn't about the money. It was about something bigger, understanding that in this world, you kept the people you could trust close, because one day you'd need them to do the same for you. Of course, trust was a tricky thing. The more I moved between crews, Irish one day, Jewish the next, Italians on Sundays, the more I learned how fragile alliances could be. I was too young to have enemies, but I was smart enough to know I'd be making them soon. By the time I turned 13, I had my own little circle, kids who could run packages, keep watch, or deliver messages without asking too many questions. We weren't dangerous. Not yet. But we were efficient. And in the Lower East Side, efficiency was the first step toward respect. One muggy summer afternoon, Meyer pulled me aside. "You got two choices," he said. "You can be a corner boy your whole life, or you can start thinking bigger." "Bigger how?" I asked. "Bigger like businessmen," he said. "Only our business don't need no store." That stuck with me. See, most kids in our neighborhood figured crime was about muscle, taking what you wanted and holding it by force. Meyer made me see it was about systems. About running things so smooth nobody even knew they were being run. Around then I started dressing better. Not to show off, but to blend in when I needed to. A clean collar could get you through doors that a knife couldn't. And in those days, getting through doors was half the game. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew the streets could turn on you. I saw it happen to a boy named Tommy Blue Marino. He'd been the loudest kid on our block, always bragging about what he stole, who he outsmarted. One night he mouthed off to the wrong man, a numbers runner who worked for bigger people uptown. Next morning, Tommy wasn't on our block anymore. Nobody said a word. Nobody had to. That was another lesson: disappearances speak louder than bullets. By 1913 I'd learned enough to know the Lower East Side wasn't where I'd end up. It was where I'd graduate from. Like a school, only the teachers carried blackjacks instead of books. One evening I was sitting on the fire escape outside our tenement, watching the city breathe. The sun had dropped and the whole neighborhood glowed with gaslight. Somewhere down on the street a violin was playing soft under the hum of voices. I thought about Sicily, about that long ocean crossing, about all the faces I'd seen come and go since we landed. And I realized something: I wasn't just surviving here anymore. I was learning how to move pieces on a board that most people didn't even know they were standing on. I didn't have wings to lose, but I had teeth. And the Lower East Side? It had just finished sharpening them. School? Sure, I went to, just not the kind with desks and chalkboards. By the time I hit 16, the Lower East Side felt too small. Not in size, there were enough streets and alleys to get lost in for a lifetime, but in ambition. I'd already learned the basics: who to pay off, who to avoid, and how to disappear when trouble came looking. But I wasn't here to just scrape by. I wanted in on the big leagues. And in New York, the big leagues all ran through one place, the 5 Points. Now, the history books will tell you the 5 Points was past its prime by the early 1910s, that the old Irish gangs who ruled it in the 1800s had been pushed out by new waves of Italians and Jews. But don't let anyone tell you it was tame. Those crooked little streets were still a jungle, only the predators had traded bowler hats for fedoras and knives for pistols. The man to know there was Paul Kelly, Italian by birth, American by necessity, and smart enough to polish his image so he could sit down with politicians one day and racketeers the next. Kelly wasn't some back-alley thug. He was a businessman in a three-piece suit, and his gang, the 5 Points Gang, was the finishing school for every kid who thought he had what it took to run more than a street corner. I got my introduction through a guy named Johnny Torrio. Back then, Torrio was already the kind of man you noticed: quiet voice, sharp mind, and eyes that measured you like he was figuring out what you were worth before you'd even said a word. Johnny liked that I could talk to anyone, Irish, Jewish, Italian, and not step on toes. That kind of versatility was rare in a city that still drew lines in the dirt between ethnic crews. So one night he takes me down to a billiard hall on Mulberry Street. The smoke's thick enough to chew, and in the back room, there he is, Paul Kelly himself, leaning on a cue stick like it's a scepter. He sizes me up, asks a few questions, nothing about what I've done, everything about how I think. And just like that, I'm in. The 5 points wasn't about petty hustles. It was an education in infrastructure, numbers games, loan sharking, gambling houses, all tied together like spokes on a wheel, each paying into the hub. We learned how to run operations that didn't just make money, but kept making money. Kelly taught me something the Lower East Side never could: the value of presentation. You didn't have to be rich to look respectable, but you had to look respectable to get rich. A pressed suit could get you a meeting with a judge. A clean shave could make a beat cop hesitate before searching you. And the right word in the right ear could do more damage than a dozen bullets. Of course, it wasn't all lectures and business plans. The streets still had a say. If a gambling house got robbed, we handled it. If a rival crew started muscling in, we paid them a visit. And visits in our world didn't come with welcome mats. One night, Kelly sends me with a crew to settle a misunderstanding with some holdouts on the East River docks. It starts with talking, it always starts with talking. But when words run out, you do what has to be done. That night, I learned what it felt like to have a man's fate resting in your hands, and how fast you had to decide whether to squeeze or let go. I won't give you the details. Let's just say, when we left, the docks were quieter than we found them. Meyer Lansky would sometimes come uptown to see me, and I'd take him to the pool halls and backrooms where the real lessons happened. He had the brains for numbers. I had the knack for people. Together, we could see patterns: how money flowed, how alliances formed and broke, and how every decision was just a trade between risk and reward. Torrio liked us. He said we reminded him of himself and another young guy he knew down in Chicago, a punk named Al Capone. Said if we played it right, we could run this city without firing a shot. I didn't believe that part. Shots were always gonna get fired. The trick was making sure they were never fired at you. The 5 points also taught me something else: loyalty had an expiration date. I saw guys who'd been shoulder to shoulder in street fights turn on each other for a bigger cut or a cleaner deal. And I learned to keep my own loyalties flexible, not cheap, but negotiable. There was one moment that sealed that lesson. A crew I ran with was pulling a quiet protection racket on a row of card rooms. Nothing heavy, just enough to remind the owners that accidents happen. One day, another crew, Italian like us, but not from our side, decided they liked our take. They sent a message, roughing up one of our guys. Kelly called a meeting. He listened to everyone shout about revenge, about making an example. Then he turned to me. "Charlie, what do you think?" I took a breath. If we go after them, we get a fight. If we talk to them, maybe we get a partnership. He smiled, just a little, and said, spoken like a man who understands the cost of bullets: "We talked to them. We split the take." And 6 months later, those same guys were backing us in a fight that actually mattered. By 18, I wasn't just running errands anymore. I was handling real collections, setting up new spots, keeping crews from killing each other long enough to make money. The Lower East Side had taught me to survive. The 5 points was teaching me to grow. One rainy night, I stood at the corner of Worth and Mulberry, watching the street lamps blur in the puddles. I thought about the ship from Sicily, the tenements, the dice games, the fights. Every step had led here, and I knew this was just another stepping stone. The real game was bigger, and it was waiting. I wasn't the top man yet. Not even close. But I was learning the rules faster than anyone else. And when you know the rules, you can start thinking about how to break them. While the rest of them were playing tough guy, I was playing banker. Prohibition, one word that changed the whole country overnight. January 1920, the Volstead Act goes into effect and suddenly every bottle of liquor in America is contraband. For most folks, it was the start of a dry, boring decade. But for people like me, it was like the government handed us the keys to Fort Knox and told us to help ourselves. See, street gangs had always been nickel and dime operations, petty rackets, gambling dens, maybe some smuggling if you knew the right dockworker. But prohibition turned crime into an industry. The demand for liquor didn't disappear, it exploded. And anyone who could supply it consistently, quietly, and with quality was gonna be richer than they ever dreamed. I'd already been moving up in the 5 points ranks, but this was different. This was opportunity on a scale I'd never seen. And I wasn't about to treat it like a street hustle. No, this was business. First thing I did was widen my circle. This wasn't a job for just Italians or just one crew. I reached out to old friends, Irish contacts from the Lower East Side, Jewish partners like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Meyer handled numbers like nobody else. Bugsy? He was the kind of guy who could make a problem disappear or appear in record time. We started small, buying from rum runners, bringing stuff down from Canada, moving it through speakeasies in Manhattan. But I saw the ceiling fast. Everyone was fighting for the same supply, so I decided to go bigger. We brought in our own shipments, forged our own connections down in the Caribbean. I wanted the supply chain under my thumb from start to finish. That's where the businessman in me started showing. See, most gangsters thought about tomorrow, maybe next week if they were careful. I was thinking in quarters, like a corporate board. We didn't just sell liquor, we branded it. We made sure every speakeasy that poured our whiskey knew it came from our pipeline, and we protected those places like they were gold mines, because they were. The suits helped, too. I stopped dressing like a street guy. No more cheap jackets or scuffed shoes. I wore tailored three-pieces, silk ties, polished Oxfords. It wasn't vanity, it was strategy. You walk into a meeting with a politician or a businessman and they see another professional, not a thug. That way, they don't realize until it's too late that you're both. We didn't avoid violence, you couldn't in our line of work, but we didn't waste it. Every bullet had to be worth the price, and every hit had to send a message. That's something a lot of guys didn't get. They'd whack somebody over an insult or a street corner. I waited until removing someone made the numbers better. In the early days, I remember a sit-down with a saloon owner on the west side. He'd been buying our booze but decided he could get it cheaper from another outfit. My guys wanted to rough him up, make an example. I told them to wait. Instead, I walked in one night, ordered a drink, and when it came, I took a sip and winced. "Rotgut," I said loud enough for the whole bar to hear. The guy turned pale. I smiled, leaned in, and said, "You sell my product, you're selling class. You sell theirs, you're selling poison. You want a reputation for poison?" He switched back to our shipments the next day and doubled his order. No punches, no blood. Just business. But success has a way of drawing eyes, some friendly, some not. Rivals started noticing the kind of territory and clientele we were picking up. Politicians noticed too, but they weren't looking to shut us down, not if they could get their cut. That's when I started greasing palms in City Hall, slipping envelopes to cops who'd look the other way during deliveries. Every dollar spent like that was an investment. Meyer was my constant sounding board. He kept our books clean enough that if you squinted, you might think we were running a legitimate import company. He also reminded me of the long game. "You don't win by taking everything, Charlie," he'd say. "You win by taking enough and keeping it." Bugsy, on the other hand, was my insurance policy. If negotiations broke down or someone needed convincing the hard way, he was your man. He had a temper, sure, but it was a useful one when pointed in the right direction. By 1925, we weren't just running liquor. We had our hands in gambling, numbers, and labor rackets. Every operation fed into the others. A speakeasy could double as a gambling den. A labor union could help move shipments or stall rivals' trucks. It was all part of the same machine. I'd walk through the city and see our fingerprints everywhere, in the music playing behind hidden doors, in the cigars smoked in private backrooms, in the smiles of men who owed me more than they realized. And I'd think, this isn't a gang anymore. This is an empire. But the bigger you get, the more you have to watch your back. I knew it was only a matter of time before someone tried to take a piece or all of what we'd built. And when it came, it wasn't gonna be some street crew. It'd be the kind of threat that could end everything overnight. That thought didn't scare me. It excited me. Because by now, I wasn't just another player, I was the man holding the ledger, deciding which names stayed in the black and which ones got crossed out. You ever feel a pair of eyes on you and know they ain't cops or friends? By the mid-1920s, New York was my boardroom. The trucks ran on time, the clubs stayed open late, and every ledger I kept, the ones in my head, not the ones on paper, showed profit. But when you're sitting high up on the ladder, the wind changes. And if you're not careful, that wind carries whispers. It started small, a glance held too long across a speakeasy, a stranger in a corner booth nursing the same drink for an hour, a phone that clicked once before the line went dead. Little things, but in my world, little things meant something big was brewing. Meyer said I was imagining it. Bugsy said if someone was looking for me, he'd make sure they regretted it. But I knew better. The streets have a language, and this was it, someone was marking my name in red. The first move came on a Tuesday night. I was leaving the Casablanca Club, jacket over my shoulder, rain making the street shine like a mirror. My driver had just pulled up when two men stepped out from a doorway. No words. Just the dull flash of steel under the street lamp. I ducked instinctively. One swung, the other lunged. I caught a glimpse of their faces, not locals. Not 5 points. These were outsiders, brought in for one job. The blade caught my shoulder before I could twist away. Pain flared white, but I kept moving. My driver floored it, and we tore down the block while they faded into the wet night. That should have been the end of it, a warning, maybe a debt collector's overzealous visit. But a week later, they came again. This time, they didn't miss. It was just after midnight. I'd left a meeting with some uptown investors, walking to my car alone. A black sedan rolled up slow beside me. Before I could turn, the door swung open and hands like iron clamps yanked me inside. The smell hit me first, stale cigarettes, damp wool, and something metallic. One of them pressed a gun into my ribs. The other slipped a blindfold over my eyes. The engine roared and the city sounds faded, replaced by the steady hum of a long drive. I tried to keep track of the turns, the bumps in the road, but it was useless. My mind was working faster than my heart, who sent them, what they wanted, how I could walk out breathing. They dragged me into what felt like a basement. Cold concrete under my shoes, the air heavy with mildew. A chair scraped against the floor and they shoved me into it. Then the blindfold came off. Two faces I didn't recognize, one tall, lean, with scars running from his jaw to his ear, the other shorter, stockier, his eyes the flat kind you see in men who've already made peace with killing. The tall one smiled. "Mr. Luciano," he said, like he was greeting me at a dinner party. "Some people think you're getting too big for your shoes." I stayed quiet. Talking too soon is how you give away the wrong card. He went on about territory, about how certain people weren't happy with my expansion. About how the old rules meant something to them. He didn't mention names, but I could guess. Joe Masuria had been eyeing me for a while. Salvatore Maranzano, too. Both old-school bosses, both the kind of men who didn't like a young player rewriting their playbook. Then came the beating. Not a message beating either, the kind you could bounce back from in a day. This was meant to break me. Fists to the ribs, boots to the legs, a blow to the face that turned the room into a carousel of shadows. But here's the thing, pain fades. Pride doesn't. And if they thought I'd crawl out of there ready to beg, they didn't know me at all. Hours later, or maybe it was minutes, hard to tell, they dumped me on a deserted stretch of Coney Island beach. The tide was coming in and the cold cut through me like glass. I lay there, tasting blood and salt water, until I heard the faint hiss of tires on sand. It was Meyer. Somehow he'd found me. Bugsy was in the back seat, a revolver on his lap, itching for payback. When they got me home, Meyer cleaned the wounds himself. Bugsy paced like a caged animal, swearing we should go after them that night. But I told him no. You kill them now, I said, and you're just answering their question for M. You're saying they rattled you. Bugsy spat, but he knew I was right. This wasn't about revenge. It was about control, showing the city that nothing, not even a kidnapping, could shake me off my game. In the days that followed, I kept moving like nothing happened. I showed up at meetings in a fresh suit, my cuts hidden under a crisp collar. I laughed in speakeasies, shook hands at racetracks. If people saw me, they saw a man untouched. But inside, something had changed. I'd always known the life was dangerous, but that was the first time it felt personal, not just business moves and territory disputes, but a direct challenge to my survival. And that? That sharpened me. From then on, every meeting, every deal, every handshake came with a question: is this man with me, or waiting to see me bleed? And the answer, most times, didn't matter. Because now I understood it wasn't about trusting people. It was about making them afraid to cross you in the first place. That night on Coney Island didn't just bruise my body. It burned something into me, a rule I'd live by from then on. You don't just defend your seat at the table. You make sure no one even thinks about pulling it out from under you. War ain't about who's right, it's about who's left standing. By 1930, the whispers had turned into gunfire. The quiet moves in backrooms, the polite threats in coded letters, all of it boiled over into what the papers called the Castellamarese War. For us, it was just business. Bloody, dangerous business. Two men were pulling the strings: Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria, the old-school don who thought tradition was the only currency worth spending, and Salvatore Maranzano, the Castellamarese upstart from Sicily who believed he was chosen to remake the whole thing in his own image. Me? I was stuck in the middle, and exactly where I wanted to be. See, both men wanted me. I had the networks, the income streams, and something neither of them could buy: relationships outside the Sicilian fold. Jews, Irish, even the politicians, they all took my calls. That made me valuable and dangerous. When the war started, Masuria claimed me first. Said I was his man, and I played along. I wore his badge in public, sat at his right hand in meetings, nodded when he talked about the old ways. But in private, I kept my ear to Maranzano's table, listening, weighing, deciding. The streets changed overnight. One week you'd see a guy laughing at a craps game, the next, his name was in the paper, his body cooling in an alley. Cops walked the beat with their eyes a little wider, reporters sniffed around for the next headline. And we all kept moving, because stopping meant becoming one of those headlines. Meyer Lansky stayed close during those years. He didn't pick sides, not officially, but he made sure I saw the numbers. War was expensive. Guns, bribes, funerals, it all added up. And the longer it went, the thinner everyone's margins got. That's when I realized something important: this war wasn't gonna be won by the man with the most soldiers. It was gonna be won by the man who ended it. Masuria was stubborn. He'd sit in his favorite restaurant, puffing cigars, talking about loyalty like it was a magic shield. But I saw the cracks. Some of his men were tired of the blood, tired of the rules, tired of watching their profits vanish into the ground with every funeral. Maranzano was different. He played the gentleman: clean suits, soft voice, the air of a man who thought he was above the rest of us. But underneath, he was as hungry as any street killer. He wanted it all, and he'd carve the city into his image if we let him. One night, I met with Maranzano in a quiet room above a bakery in Brooklyn. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the scent of the pistol in my pocket. He poured me a glass of wine, smiled like an uncle, and said, "Charlie, you're a smart man. Too smart to die for someone else's pride." I didn't answer right away. In our world, silence is a kind of currency. Finally, I said, "If I help you, I don't want to be another general in your army. I want something bigger. His eyes narrowed, just a flicker, but then he nodded. Bigger can be arranged. From that night on, my mind was made up. I'd been wearing Masuria's colors, but I was gonna hand Maranzano the winning card. And the card was Joe the boss himself. The setup took weeks. Meetings in safe houses, coded messages, false leads to keep suspicion low. All the while, the streets kept bleeding. Drive-bys, ambushes, disappearances, the war ate men alive, and the survivors carried scars you couldn't see. One of those weeks, Bugsy Siegel came to me hot, waving a paper with a list of our dead. "Charlie, this can't go on," he said. "You gotta make a move." I just nodded. I was already making it. The final piece fell into place when I suggested a peace meeting to Masuria. I told him I'd line it up at a place he liked, a quiet spot in Coney Island where the food was good and the walls didn't talk. He agreed. Old men like Joe the boss always believe they're untouchable, right up until the last second. On the day, I walked in with him, playing the loyal lieutenant. We sat, ordered, made small talk. When the time came, I excused myself to the restroom. As I walked away, I heard the faintest creak of the back door opening. A moment later, the shots came, sharp, quick, final. When I came back, Joe the boss was slumped over the table, cards still in his hands. They said later it was fitting, a poker hand at the end for a man who bet everything on the wrong people. The war didn't end that night, but the writing was on the wall. Without Masuria, Maranzano moved fast, consolidating power, calling himself boss of bosses. I played along again, smiling in his meetings, nodding at his speeches. But I was already thinking 2 steps ahead. Because here's the thing, I hadn't survived the Lower East Side, the 5 points, and a kidnapping just to trade one boss for another. Maranzano was sharp, but he made one mistake: he believed in a system that made him the king. I didn't believe in kings. I believed in boards, commissions, networks. Systems that didn't depend on one man staying alive. And as I watched Maranzano start carving up the city to his liking, I knew one thing: the war might be ending, but the real game was just getting started. Joe the boss thought he was untouchable. Turns out, everyone's touchable. When Joe Masuria hit the floor in Coney Island, the war shifted. But it didn't end, it just changed hands. Salvatore Maranzano stepped into the vacuum like a man sliding into a tailored suit. He didn't just want to run things, he wanted to rule. Boss of bosses, he called himself. Sounded grand, like something out of a history book. But in our world, titles like that come with a countdown. At first, I let him have his moment. I smiled in his meetings, raised my glass when he toasted to order, and nodded along when he started reorganizing the families. He gave me one of the top spots, made it clear he saw me as an ally. But I also saw what he was doing behind the curtain, stacking his inner circle with loyalists from Castellammarese, freezing out the younger guys, putting rules in place that made him untouchable. Or so he thought. See, Maranzano made the mistake of thinking old world power worked in a new world city. He ran things like a feudal lord, tributes, rituals, little shows of dominance. I wasn't built for that. Neither were the guys coming up behind me. And then came the whispers. Same kind I'd heard before my kidnapping. Only this time, they weren't about me, they were from me. Maranzano had started talking to certain people in certain offices about cleaning house. The list of names he wanted gone? Mine was at the top. That was enough for me. In my world, you didn't wait for a man to make his move, you made yours first. The plan came together quick. Meyer Lansky was in. Bugsy Siegel was in. We brought in a few Jewish boys from the old neighborhood, guys Maranzano wouldn't recognize, wouldn't suspect. The idea was simple: get close, strike fast, disappear. September 10, 1931. Maranzano was in his office at the New York Central Building, meeting with his top men. I'd made sure I had a business engagement across town, something that gave me an alibi without drawing attention. The team I sent in looked like IRS agents, clean suits, hats low, briefcases in hand. In those days, even a boss thought twice before turning away the tax man. They walked in, showed their credentials, and in the moment Maranzano's guard dropped, they pulled the steal. It was over in seconds. No speeches. No theatrics. Just cold efficiency. The news hit the street like a thunderclap. The boss of bosses was gone just like that. Some people were shocked. Others, quietly relieved. Me? I felt the air change. It was like the city itself took a deep breath. I didn't step forward as the new king. That was the point. I told everyone there'd be no more boss of bosses. The title was dead, buried with Maranzano. In its place, we'd have something new, the commission. A table where the most powerful families could meet as equals, argue, deal, and keep the blood off the streets, most of the time. It was more than a power move. It was a statement: this thing of ours wasn't gonna be ruled by one man's ego anymore. It was gonna be run like a business. And in business, the smartest man in the room didn't have to sit at the head of the table to own it. That night, I walked the streets of Manhattan like nothing had happened. The lights were bright, the clubs were loud, and every doorman nodded just a little lower when I passed. They didn't know the details, not yet, but they could feel it. Something had shifted. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving, I was steering the whole ship. I didn't want to be a king, I wanted to be the man who built the kingdom. After Maranzano hit the floor, there was a moment, just a moment, when everyone held their breath. The kind of silence you get after a gunshot in a crowded room. You don't know who's in charge yet, but you know somebody's about to find out. In the old days, that silence meant the next man in line would step up, crown himself the new capo di tutti capi, boss of bosses. That was the Sicilian way. And the Sicilian way had just gotten two of the most powerful men in America put in the ground inside of 18 months. I wasn't about to make it 3. I called a meeting not of soldiers or street captains, but of the heads. The men who ran the most powerful families in the country: Chicago, Buffalo, Detroit, Cleveland, Philly. Even Jersey had a seat at the table. And for the first time, the Jewish outfits weren't just associates, they were in the room on equal footing. We met in a quiet spot in Midtown. Heavy curtains, thick carpets, no windows anyone could see through. Every man came with a bodyguard, but the real weapons were the ledgers in our heads. We weren't there to argue over turf or settle old grudges. We were there to write a new constitution for this thing of ours. I told them straight: no more boss of bosses. No more one man holding the crown. From now on, we run this like a corporation, a board of directors. We call it the commission. I laid out the plan. Every major family got a seat. Disputes would be brought to the table, not the streets. Big jobs, territory changes, hits on made men had to be approved by a majority. No more surprises. No more week-long bloodbaths over who owned which block. Some of them didn't like it. The old-timers muttered about tradition, about losing our way. I reminded them that tradition had just gotten a lot of good men buried and a lot of money lost. You can't spend pride, and you can't hand down a throne if you're in a coffin. Chicago backed me quick. Frank Nitti saw the value. Al Capone was already cooling his heels in prison, and the outfit needed structure more than ever. Buffalo was in. Detroit, too. Slowly, the room started nodding. We didn't just agree on rules, we built a system. We set territories, carved up the unions, mapped out the gambling circuits from coast to coast. It was like laying train tracks across the whole country, and every track led to one station, the commission. I could feel the shift happening in real time. This wasn't about being feared anymore. Fear gets you compliance, structure gets you longevity. When the meeting ended, we didn't shake hands like street hoods. We signed our names on a piece of paper that didn't exist anywhere but in our memories. That was the point, no evidence, no trail, just a pact between men who understood the value of quiet. Over the next year, you could see the difference on the streets. The shootings slowed down. Money flowed smoother. Crews started thinking long-term, buying businesses, laundering clean, investing in construction and shipping. We weren't just gangsters anymore. We were businessmen who happened to carry guns. Meyer called it the golden age. Bugsy just called it smart. I called it necessary. And make no mistake, I was still the man with the most influence in the room. I didn't need the title. Titles put a target on your back. I had something better: respect, alliances, and the quiet understanding that if I wanted something to happen, it happened. One night, I walked out of a commission meeting into the warm summer air. Times Square was buzzing, lights blazing, music spilling from clubs, taxis honking like angry geese. I stood there a moment, watching the city move, and I realized this wasn't just my turf anymore. This was my machine. Every flickering bulb, every bottle uncorked in a speakeasy, every stack of chips at a backroom table, all of it fed into the system I'd built. I hadn't crowned myself king. I'd made myself the architect of the kingdom. And architects, unlike kings, they can live to see their work last. Money solves problems until it starts creating new ones. The 1930s were good to me. Not just good, golden. The war was over, the commission was running smooth, and for the first time in my life, I could walk into any restaurant in New York and know the room belonged to me, even if I didn't own it on paper. The papers started calling me the underworld's gentleman. I liked that. I wasn't some back alley tough guy anymore. I was a businessman who happened to do his best work off the books. My suits were from Savile Row, my shoes from Italy. I kept my hair slicked and my shirts crisp. If you're gonna be a figure in this city, you gotta look like you belong in its finest rooms. Money was pouring in from everywhere: gambling joints, union rackets, drug pipelines, construction contracts. Liquor was still moving even after the repeal. We just shifted from running booze to running everything else people wanted. Every vice had its season, and we made sure we were the ones selling tickets. Nights were for the clubs, the Stork Club, the Copacabana. The bands played hot, the girls laughed easy, and every politician who claimed to hate vice had a drink in his hand and an envelope in his coat pocket. It was a game, and I knew how to play it. Meyer Lansky stayed the numbers man, making sure the cash didn't just come in, but stayed clean enough to reinvest. Bugsy Siegel? He was restless, always chasing the next big thing. I let him. A man like Bugsy needed an outlet, or he'd find one in a way that caused problems. Looking back, those years felt like standing on the balcony of the highest building in Manhattan. The lights stretch out forever and you think there's nothing that can touch you. But the higher you stand, the more people can see you. And not all those eyes are friendly. The cops were always there, hovering at the edges. They couldn't pin too many layers between me and the street, but they tried. The bigger threat, though, wasn't the law. It was ambition. Not mine, theirs. The young guys coming up, the rivals in other cities, the partners who started thinking they didn't need a partner anymore. One night I was at the Copa, sitting with a couple of showgirls and a senator who'd sworn under oath he'd never met me. Meyer slipped into the booth, looking calm but speaking in that careful tone he used when trouble was brewing. "Charlie," he said, "there's talk out of Jersey. A few of the smaller outfits are testing the edges, moving into your numbers territory. I can handle it quietly." I nodded, but it stuck with me. In the old days, a move like that meant a war. Now it meant paperwork, a sit-down, a cut of the take, maybe a reshuffling of the deck. But the feeling was the same: somebody was looking up at the balcony, wondering if they could knock me off it. It wasn't just Jersey. The feds were starting to take organized crime seriously. They'd gotten Capone on taxes, and that gave them ideas. Every time I opened a paper, there was some headline about mob infiltration or gangland activity. It was noise, but noise has a way of turning into music if you don't turn it off fast enough. Still, I wasn't about to spend the golden years hiding. I traveled Cuba, Los Angeles, even a trip to Rome to see family. Everywhere I went, the introductions were smooth, the doors open. Money does that. So does reputation. I started thinking about legacy. Not just mine, but the thing of ours. The commission was strong, but I knew it would only last if the men running it kept thinking like businessmen. You can teach a guy how to pull a trigger in a day. Teaching him how to balance power without blowing everything up? That's harder. And maybe that's why I didn't see it coming, the thing that would start the cracks. It didn't come from a rival or a rookie trying to make a name. It came from a man in a clean suit carrying a badge. One thing I forgot: the law doesn't sleep, even if you think you own it. The first time I heard the name Thomas E. Dewey, it didn't bother me. Some ambitious prosecutor making noise in Manhattan. I'd seen 100 like him. Most were happy to take a handshake, an envelope, and a promise to keep their names out of the papers. But Dewey? He was different. He didn't want a handshake, he wanted a headline. By the mid-1930s, Dewey had built a reputation as a gangbuster. He took down rackets, paraded mugshots in the press, made speeches about cleaning up New York. And the more the papers loved him, the more dangerous he became. At first, I figured I could steer him away. My lawyers made calls, my friends in City Hall dropped hints. But Dewey didn't flinch. Then the whispers started: he was building a case against me. Not my people, not my fronts, me personally. The charge? Prostitution. Now, I didn't run brothels myself. But in this city, you didn't have to own something for the law to say you did. The racket was connected to people connected to me. And connections were all a man like Dewey needed. It started like a shadow creeping over the business. One day a club owner tells me some of his girls have been hauled in by vice cops. The next, a courier doesn't show. Then a lieutenant gets picked up and doesn't make bail. Dewey's office was squeezing from the bottom up, looking for someone to talk. Meyer told me to get out of the country for a while, let the heat die down. Bugsy wanted to send Dewey a message he wouldn't forget. I said no to both. Running made you look guilty, threatening made you look scared. I wasn't about to look like either. But Dewey was patient. He sent his investigators into every corner of my world. They tailed my cars, leaned on my bankers, turned my bartenders into witnesses. And little by little, they built a case that looked clean enough for the jury. The day they came for me, it was early spring 1936. I was at the Waldorf, having lunch like nothing was wrong. Dewey's men walked in like they owned the place. They didn't raise their voices, didn't make a scene. They didn't have to. The whole room went quiet as they read the warrant. The trial was a circus. The papers called it the case of the century. Dewey stood there in his crisp suit, telling the jury I was the king of a vast vice empire, that nothing happened in New York without my say-so. My lawyers tore into the witnesses, but the prosecution had stacked the deck. Girls from the brothels told their stories. Detectives mapped out the connections. And every time my name came up, the jury's eyes got a little colder. In court, I kept my face calm. Inside, I was counting the moves I'd missed. I'd built a system to keep me untouchable in the streets, but I'd underestimated a man who could turn the court into his battlefield. When the verdict came, it felt like the air got heavier. Guilty. On 62 counts. The sentence? 30 to 50 years in Dannemora, the Siberia of America. They shipped me upstate like I was any other con. Steel bars, cold floors, guards who made a point of letting me know I wasn't the boss here. The papers said it was the end of Luciano. But they didn't know me. I'd played this game too long to believe the board couldn't be flipped. From my cell, I kept in touch with Meyer, with the commission. Business didn't stop just because I was behind a wall. But I also started thinking about time, how much of it I really had, and how I was gonna use it. And then, like always, the streets threw me an opening. Only this time, it didn't come from the streets. It came from Washington. Turns out Uncle Sam needed me more than I needed him. Prison changes a man, not just the walls, the cold, the way the nights echo with other men's regrets, but the rhythm of it. In Dannemora, time didn't pass, it stacked. Same walls, same faces, same routine, over and over. For most guys, that's the end of the story. But I'd never been most guys. By 42, the world was burning. The Japanese had hit Pearl Harbor, the Germans were marching through Europe, and the U.S. was in the thick of World War II. That meant every port, every dock, every supply line became a battlefield, even the ones in our own backyard. And that's when the rumors started. Whispers in the yard. Guards talking just low enough to make sure you heard them. The Navy was having trouble. Ships were getting sabotaged, cargo disappearing, and no one could prove how. But the smart money said it was enemy agents working the docks. See, the docks in New York weren't just steel and water. They were a living, breathing system, and for decades, men like me had been the ones keeping that system running and deciding who got to touch it. If you wanted something in or out, you went through our channels. That was true in peacetime. In wartime? Even more so. One cold morning, I got a visit not from a lawyer, not from Meyer, but from a man in a plain suit with government eyes. He sat across from me in the visiting room, leaned in, and said, "We know you still have influence on the waterfront, Mr. Luciano. We need that influence." I didn't smile. Not yet. I'd been in the game too long to give anything away for free. "What's in it for me?" I asked. "Cooperation," he said. "And consideration for your sentence." Consideration. That was a fancy way of saying they might open the cell door a little sooner if I played ball. The deal was simple on paper, complicated in practice. From my cell, I'd send word down the line, through visitors, through lawyers, through the kind of messages you can write without ever touching a pen. My people would make sure the docks were clean of enemy spies, that the longshoremen kept the Navy happy, that supplies got where they needed to go without accidents. It worked. The sabotage reports slowed. The cargo started moving without hiccups. And the Navy made sure the right people knew why. For 2 years, I played my part. And in 1946, the consideration they promised turned into action. The governor commuted my sentence. Officially, it was for services rendered to the war effort. Unofficially? It was because Uncle Sam had used my reach when it mattered, and debts like that don't just disappear. There was a catch, of course. Freedom didn't mean I could go back to my old corner booth at the Copa. As part of the deal, I was deported. Straight to Italy, the country I'd left as a boy, now the place I'd have to call home. Standing on the deck of that ship, watching the New York skyline fade, I thought about everything I'd built and everything I was leaving behind. The commission was still mine in spirit, but from now on I'd be running my life at arm's length. But if prison had taught me anything, it was this: a man with patience can run a kingdom from anywhere, even an ocean away. Havana was beautiful, but it wasn't home. The air in Naples had a different weight to it, saltier, heavier, and it carried a silence I wasn't used to. In New York, the streets hummed, cabs, voices, music, a city that never let you forget you were alive. Here, it was the sound of the sea against the stone, the calls of fishermen hauling in their catch, the church bells in the afternoon. I was free, sure. But freedom in exile is just another kind of cage. Italy treated me like both a curiosity and a problem. Some people remembered the boy who'd left poor, others knew the man who'd returned rich in reputation, if not in the pocket. The authorities kept a close eye not because they thought I'd start running rackets on the cobblestones, but because they knew my voice still carried weight an ocean away. And it did. The commission was alive and well in New York, and my friends, the right ones, kept me in the loop. Deals were still made with my blessing. Disputes still came to me for a word. But it wasn't the same. You can steer a ship from shore, but you can't feel the waves. Cuba, though, that was different. Havana in the late 40s was electric. Casinos glittered along the Malecon, music spilled out of open windows, and American dollars flowed like rum. Meyer was there. Bugsy came through, and for a while it almost felt like the old days. We talked business over cigars, played cards until dawn, and watched the city light up like Manhattan with palm trees. But politics has a way of spoiling paradise. The Cuban government, under pressure from the U.S., decided my presence was bad for business, at least officially. One morning I got the word, "Pack your bags." By nightfall, I was back on a boat to Italy. The years that followed were quieter. I kept my suit sharp, my shoes polished. I'd walk the Naples waterfront, watch the ships come in, and wonder what cargo they carried, whose pockets it would line, whose plans it would make possible. Old habits never leave you, they just slow down. People still came to see me. Old associates, new faces wanting advice, sometimes even lawmen who'd once chased me. I never gave too much, never too little. Just enough to remind them that the name Lucky Luciano still meant something. By the early 60s, I knew my time was running short. Not because of any enemy, though God knows I had plenty, but because you can't outrun the clock forever. Still, I wanted one last move. In January 1962, I arranged to meet an American movie producer at the Naples airport. He wanted to make a film about my life, my version of it. We'd been talking for weeks, and this meeting was supposed to seal the deal. I dressed sharp that morning, double-breasted suit, silk tie, polished Oxfords. The kind of outfit that made people stand up straighter when you walked in. I got to the airport early. The air smelled of fuel and espresso. I lit a cigarette, went over what I'd say when the cameras started rolling. And then, as I spotted the producer walking toward me, it happened. A pain in my chest, sharp and sudden. The cigarette slipped from my fingers. The room tilted, the voices around me muffled. I felt myself falling, not to the floor, but into a kind of darkness that was strangely calm. They said I was gone before I hit the ground. I've heard they buried me back in America, in Queens, near the city that made me. Seems fitting. I'd crossed oceans, fought wars, both in the streets and in the shadows, but in the end I went back to where it all began. Some say I was a gangster. Others, a businessman. Some call me a criminal, some call me a visionary. The truth? I was all of it. And maybe that's why my name's still spoken even now, because I played the game like it mattered, and I never let anyone else hold the pen when it came to writing my ending.